Hey, Gorge. Okay, there we go.
Okay.
Yeah,
One thing I like about Zoom is that you're allowed to smoke in the green room.
That's
Don't
great.
worry, I'll get rid of it before the kids come in.
That's funny.
Hi, everybody. Wow, you're popular, Rebecca. That's great. There's pages of you. Who said that? Biden? Romney? Well, there was a president
A
who said
binder
pages of
full,
a
a
Binder?
binder
binder
full of
full
women.
of
There's
women.
pages filled with artists. Yeah.
A lot of people I know, how sweet, and people
Isn't it
haven't
great?
seen for so long, and people who don't live in California.
Isn't it funny to have a show up like that? Doesn't it feel like you're walking around LA naked?
The push before is so intense that you sort of just immersed in that energy of it. You're almost unconscious. And
Mhm.
now this is the point at which you return back to earth. And you feel very vulnerable,
Yeah.
very vulnerable.
Rebecca, welcome. It's such a privilege to have you here at this special time in your artist life cycle right after this incredible, incredible show that you've just had. Shayna and I were both there and we were like, you just feel like, oh, this is an important moment in art history type of a show. And that's what kind of show this was. I think I wrote about your work almost 20 years ago when I was founding arts editor of the Huffington Post, maybe even before that. I think I have an interview with you called Fear and Faith. And I had just discovered you because I heard you being interviewed on the radio in maybe it was KCRW. I don't remember when people listened to the radio in those days instead of podcasts. And but anyway, I've never stopped being madly in love with your work. And I want to give Shayna a chance to kind of talk about her introduction to you as well.
Yes, thank you. Very excited. I too was blown away. We'll get to a little thing that I wrote about it a little later in the conversation. Um, I have been trying to figure it out. I will say that, like, Rebecca, when was the show at LA Louver where you kind of rebuilt your childhood house out of painted bricks?
That was Poltergeist.
Right.
And I think the year would have been maybe 2009
11.
or 2011. I
Yeah.
was
Okay,
pregnant with someone.
you were you were pregnant with someone that I think I just finished having dinner with the other day. So that's how time works.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And okay, because I have one of the little bricks from that wall.
Oh,
And I'm sure that I knew you before that, but that's my first clear memory of you is my mind exploding when you were explaining to me that by painting your childhood home, you actually meant physically building a version of the home inside the gallery out of paintings, which is not the same thing. And I was like, oh my God, who is this woman? And I've basically been obsessed with you ever since then, but not in a creepy way.
just
But
side note,
and then
those
we had the
doors.
ability to be in conversation with each other more deeply ever since then. And it's been, yeah.
Yeah. Just a side note that the doors were my parents' actual front doors for that exhibition. They went without their doors in the middle of the winter for a month in like February. Yeah. For
So
LA.
not to be
So
clear, they're old doors that were somehow salvaged, but like the literal doors that they
were
needed
taken
in their
off
house
and
where they
then
were living.
reattached.
Definitely right
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But it was
I remember doing a studio visit with you for another exhibition that you had, because I just want to emphasize how profound, like how special your attachment to the significance of the authenticity of the origins of something. You were making a large painting that had a plaid in it, and you wanted to know the clan that the plaid represented and whether or not it was related to the person. You know what I'm saying? Like that's Rebecca
Yeah.
Campbell for you. That's special. By the way, I did not properly introduce Shayna. Shayna Zambrot. So I just want to give it a chance to do that. So Shayna, who is you've been, you know, a writer, an art critic for LA Weekly, and you've been, you've written in every magazine and every, you know, you're one of my absolute favorite writers in Los Angeles. You've done the most incredible essays, introductions to so many people. And you also have just launched a Substack. I want to say this right off the top, called 13 Weeks.
13 things.
13 things.
It's all about alliteration.
Yeah.
13 things, LA. Yeah.
13 Things LA. And how do people find it? And we'll put it all in the chat also, but it's
yeah, I'll put the link to the one that Rebecca's in, which is as good a place to start with it as any, in the chat at some point. I'm not gonna make you watch me, you know, watch me try to find it on my I'll do it when you're not looking at me.
Yeah.
But,
So but anyways,
yeah,
Shayna's take on LA artists, it's like, if you have not been under the spell of Shayna's words, it's like you don't exist. It's like a tree falls in LA type of thing. So anyway, so I'm thrilled to have you join this interview.
Sure.
You know, so
thank you. No, and you know, I feel the same way about you. And of course, Huffington Post was one of the places that I first got a lot of writing out into the world, which wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't an art section. So giant love fest. Rebecca for me is one of, in a way, the easiest artists to write about. And what I mean by that, before you dive into going through it with Rebecca herself, which is what we're all waiting for. What I mean by that, easiest to write about, is that I love things that, you know, the world is kind of catching up a little bit, but it's always been a little bit almost against the stream to be as obsessed with things like beauty and craftsmanship and technique and narrative and symbolism and autobiography and allegory and like literature and, you know, all just that sort of like explosion of techniques and really kind of showing off in the studio. Like that's been my happy place. And I've been swimming through a world of like disembodied conceptual nonsense my whole adult life. And every once in a while, I find this incredible place, like safe place. And it's an artist like Rebecca. And that sort of, I feel, explains my obsession with it, is the way that all of those things come together is like, yes, like the thing that makes you go, oh my God, look at that. And then put your face up on it and try to figure what's going on. And then go back and like see it again. And just like the flat out, like yummy, chewy gorgeousness of it is something that has sort of been like almost like a guilty pleasure for me in my career. And the older I get, the more I'm like, fuck it, that's what I love. So that is the other sort of path through my appreciation of the work. So that's my.
And then I thought that's a perfect way to lead into what was the postcard painting, which immediately caught my eye. And I thought, because you use that for the opening, the doorway into the show, and you know, we all have like magical attributions to the magic painting that's going to draw people in, and this definitely drew me in. Tell us about it. Tell us about this
painting in particular,
if you don't mind. Yeah.
I don't mind. One thing I wanted to mention, I think is interesting that Shayna just said, it's my guilty pleasure. I think that that's an interesting intellectual problem, because for me, you know, where I came from, which was a very repressive, kind of intellectually repressive place, I had to fight so hard for the intellectual life that I achieved. Like, I was told not to go to college. So I fought really hard for the abstract. The physical was given to me. You know, I learned to bake bread. I consider my first performance piece sort of laying in the cold stream behind my house. But interestingly, so my undergraduate work was very focused. Pacific Northwest College of Art, which was one of the last remaining sort of museum schools, was very focused on teaching you how to make things,
Oops,
very oriented toward craft. So 4 years of printmaking, 4 years of sculpture, 4 years of figure drawing. And so I learned to make everything. But interestingly there, I was the first mixed media installation thesis they accepted, which was more conceptual. And I studied with a woman named Christy Edmonds, who went on to run the program at UCLA, the performance program. And so I was kind of more conceptual there. And the interesting thing was, I ended up at UCLA for my graduate work, in which there was craft and object making was de-emphasized, and the conceptual was put to the front. And interestingly, I found myself in the reverse position, having to defend the sort of intelligence of the body. And for me, that means the paint, that means the object, the intelligence of a visceral experience versus an analytical experience. So for me, I think my work, I've always been interested in the nexus between those two things. So I think it's interesting that people see the work as being beautiful, object-oriented, maker-oriented. And then when they hear about it, they realize that there's a lot of conceptual work that goes into these paintings. And I hope they span both of those.
It's that is such a beautiful way to put it. And it essentially forced you to be a rebel when you got to campus, you know?
Right. It's very
I'm showing work from 2002, by the way, while you're talking,
sure.
Just because I thought if you don't mind, I thought I'd mess around on your website until we dive into the show while we're talking. What do you think of that?
Yeah, do it for sure.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting because you can, I mean, the most controversial thing that I felt like I could do weirdly in 2000 at UCLA was to make paintings about, you know, fairy tales is actually what I was making paintings about at the time. And that you could really piss Paul McCarthy off by making a painting like that. And I thought, you know, what else is that's an interesting space to be, because of course, I had already done the hard work of defending sort of the bizarre, the outside. And in Salt Lake City, Utah, you know, I'm like a bra burning communist. Like they think of me in a very like punk rock kind of way. And in Los Angeles, you know, I'm like the mom painter, which I love both of those. And I think they fit pretty beautifully together. And I think that's new space and territory to explore. So, I mean,
we have to pause.
You want to talk about this painting?
Well, we just have to gush over your paint handling, because you know, again, this is what I think this is the time that I was writing about your work. So it was a long time ago. And I remember seeing it and realizing to myself that I was seeing something that I had never seen before in nature, which
this painting almost killed me. This is one of the paintings that really, you can say this, and it's so much easier said than done, that sometimes you have to throw a painting away in order to let it rise. And this painting was slated I was going to Basel. Perfect timing. So I was making a giant painting for Basel. I'm a pretty organized person, so I planned way in advance. Started this painting like 3-4 months in advance, and it absolutely refused to conform to the schedule. And what happened, because how do you describe this moment? I mean, this is actually a scene sort of pulled from my memory of Salt Lake City, Utah, you know, escaping into the woods with my boyfriend and doing all the things we're not supposed to do. And yet I wanted to deal with art history. This is really a painting about the odalisque, but it's also a painting about the gaze. And you see here that the figure is reversed, and you're not sort of allowed to see into the female figure. And the boy taking a whiz in the woods is the object. We're looking at him. She's looking at him. But the day, the grandeur, the beauty of it all. And so the processes I went through are ridiculous. So the entire, and this is a very big painting. I think it's like 9 by 13.
I was just
or
looking at
something.
that.
It's
And
very
it's all,
big.
it also alludes
Those-
to Manet's Le Déjeuner sous l'herbe,
100%.
because you have the two, Jano and I were thinking that exact same time, but
Yeah.
you know, you don't have the two men in the front and then the woman in the background bathing, but it's the man, and the roles are reversed, and it's such a brilliant take. And also the name Jack and Diane, which reminds me of that song.
Mellencamp. It's
Yeah, right,
it's a
right,
reference
yeah.
directly to that. So a little bit more about the technique. The entire painting, if you see, we don't have good details of this, but if you see, there's tiny, tiny, tiny little marks that I was thinking a lot about, and I still think a lot about Klimt's landscapes. People focus on the figurative work, but the landscapes are brilliant. And I'm obsessed with them, and they have a lot of density, and the space is interesting. So I painted the entire background in those tiny, tiny little marks. So a brush smaller than my pinky across the whole surface. And I looked at it and I was like, well, it looks great, but it doesn't feel like that moment. It doesn't have the sort of rapturous, sort of out of control feeling of the wind, being naked outside, all of those things. So after that, I fashioned a spray bottle, kind of like a very low tech airbrush wannabe with spray bottles. And I sprayed the entire back surface. And it had new things that I liked about it, but it still wasn't there. And you can see some of that buried in this piece. And then then I went back with medium brushes. And the very last thing I did was I went back with an angled kitchen broom, which you see in the marks at the bottom on the ground and also in the sky. So all of those things finally came together to make this painting. But it was I'll say this anecdote, which is a true story, which was one day I went outside, you know, I was living in this crazy warehouse space, and I went outside, and, you know, it was morning and I was having coffee really quickly. I went back in and I worked for what seemed a really long time. It felt like a long time. And I went back outside to sort of get some fresh air. And I was like, looks like morning again. And it was morning again. And I had worked for 24 hours without really registering what I was doing. So this painting was incredibly difficult and immersive. And it's at the right now.
It paid off in the deepest way. And the show, I ended up seeing, because at the, you know, maybe I don't know if I had started the art section yet, but I was writing about artists, but I started to see deliberate copycats, like people, which they couldn't do, of course, but people attempting to emulate the feeling of paint that just sort of landed like in one shot, you know?
I mean,
like
here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Because Rebecca, as you were describing that, I'm thinking to myself, well, that's like literally what the forest like is, right? Like it's a combination of 200 billion tiny individual leaves physically, but our brains might kind of get that, but that's not how we see it. But nor do we see it as just a big blur of color. Like it really physically is in between all those things. Like that's what a tree looks like. So
yeah. And for me,
like, I'm sorry you went through that on a deadline, but that's kind of like, it makes, as you were describing that physical process of all the different kinds of paint applications, which are tethered to the different kinds of ways we see things.
Yeah.
It's
And
like
you
it
make
had
an
to be-
excellent point that the paint is content, narrative content. So I think one of the dangers of being a sort of realist painter is that you fall into kind of a slave master relationship with the image in which you just report back to the image, which to me is very airless and boring and does not contain within it the complexity of the way we see. So I think of realistic painting as a tool that exists in the box, and the most dangerous tool, because it really is a very selfish tool that wants to be the loudest thing in the room all the time, because it's People love it. It's very flashy. It's easy to communicate things, but sometimes it needs to be put down and relieved, and the paint needs to be able, because the story the paint tells is one of my 16-year-old keeps texting me and I don't know how to turn it off on my computer. He's
We
like,
don't
"Can I
see
go to
it."
my girlfriend's house? Can I go to my girlfriend's house? So the paint, for instance, if you have a sort of, there's a bit of paint in the biggest painting in the current show, and it's a little yellow splash that happens right next to the one of the figures. And you have this little yellow